From Park Thrillers blog, I'm Sean Smith, and this is National Park Talk. On today's episode of National Park Talk, we're going to discuss one of the most important pieces of legislation that's helped preserve and protect millions of acres of America's wildlands, historic sites, and cultural spots. Of course, I'm talking about the Antiquities Act of 1906. Passed in June of 1906, the Antiquities Act is a law passed by Congress which gives the President of the United States the authority through executive action to preserve and protect places of historic, scientific, and cultural significance for present and future generations. The act was first used by President Teddy Roosevelt in 1906 to designate Devil's Tower in northeastern Wyoming as the world's first national monument. Teddy Roosevelt saw the importance of the Antiquities Act, which grew out of an understanding at the turn of the last century that America's wilderness, America's public domain, was quickly being gobbled up by development, by farms, for industry, and that some of those sites could be lost forever if Congress and the President didn't act quickly. The congressional action was often slow, and so things like the Antiquities Act, which allows the President to act independent of Congress, were deemed necessary at that time. It actually was not unprecedented for the President to have the authority to set aside specific segments of the public domain, the federal public domain. In fact, Congress had allowed and established legislation to allow the President to designate national forests, which Teddy Roosevelt used quite liberally to establish millions of acres as national forest land. He also then used the act to establish, as I've mentioned earlier, national monuments. His first, as I stated, was Devil's Tower, testing out the authority. He then later used his interpretation of the Antiquities Act to basically establish and protect all of the Grand Canyon. He established Grand Canyon National Monument. As I said, Teddy Roosevelt read the legislation liberally when it stated that places of scientific and historic and cultural significance could be set aside with the Antiquities Act. And Teddy read that to mean places like the Grand Canyon were of scientific, historic, and cultural significance. The Act also places limits, though, on how large those sites can be. The designation has to be the smallest site possible to protect those important resources. And Teddy interpreted that to mean that 800,000 acres were needed in order to protect Grand Canyon National Monument. The incredible thing about national monuments, or the Antiquities Act, is that many national monuments are later turned into national parks. And so the President's quick action can preserve and protect these places for future Congresses to then review to say whether those monuments should be decommissioned or, in many cases, elevated to national park status. So in my opinion, the Antiquities Act is one of the most important pieces of conservation legislation that Congress has ever passed. Unfortunately, though, many in Congress don't see the legislation that way, and we'll talk a little bit about that after the break. Since its passage in 1906, the Antiquities Act has been used by nearly every president that's held the executive office. In fact, the act has been used more than 120 times to establish national monuments across the United States, from, as I mentioned earlier, Devil's Tower in Wyoming to most recently the Belmont Paul Women's Equity National Monument in the District of Columbia. One of the things that's often overlooked or misunderstood about the use of the Antiquities Act is that critics often contend that it's used to seize private property, and this is simply not the case. The Antiquity Act specifically limits the president's power to designate monuments only to federal property. So in order for a place to be elevated to a national monument, it has to first be owned by the federal government. Private property or state land cannot be used in designating a national monument unless that state land and private property has been given over to the federal government. So every national monument that's been established since 1906 was already federal property. We often hear in the press or from critics that it's a land grab or federal seizure of public property, and it's simply not the case. The land already belonged and was managed by the federal government. The president merely designated that land as a national monument, giving it increased status and, in many cases, increased protection. This misunderstanding about how national parks are established or what lands and resources can be designated a national monument also plays into a misunderstanding of how and what the process is for designating national monuments. Often critics, especially out west, will say that when a national monument is established, the president failed to consult with the appropriate local and state governments. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the Antiquities Act is reserved for the president. It's his or her authority to designate national monuments. But also, the president can only designate resources, as I mentioned earlier, that are already federally owned. Therefore, the federal government does not have to consult or ask local and state governments for their permission to designate a national monument. It makes good political sense to do that, but there's nothing in the law that requires the President of the United States to get the okay from state and local governments in order to designate a national monument. But that argument is often thrown up as a way to cast illegitimacy over the president's action, to basically say he ran around the public in order to establish this monument. And again, that's clearly not the case. The legislation, the Antiquities Act, was passed by Congress with debate, just like any other act, and that gives the president the authority to designate national monuments. That action has actually even been held up by the courts, and so the president, as I said earlier, doesn't have to get local or state permission to designate a national monument. But again, it makes good political sense to do this. You obviously want to include people that may be upset or concerned by a national monument designation. But often, as Teddy Roosevelt understood, protecting public places, natural resources often takes bold action. And it's likely you will never get everyone to agree that a place needs to be preserved and protected as a national monument. So the president often is going to upset someone and make others very happy when he designates a national monument. Of those 120 plus national monuments, the vast majority were placed under the Department of Interior to be managed by the National Park Service, roughly 80 of those. The remainder are under agencies like the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Department of Energy, and the Department of Defense, roughly 40 of those. As I mentioned earlier, the Antiquities Act authorities are pretty broad. They allow for the president to establish monuments on federal property, but they don't contain any limits on or restrictions on where those monuments can be placed, as in which agency is required to manage them. So the president has the authority to place a national monument under the Park Service or any other federal land management agency like the Fish and Wildlife Service or BLM. This has created some confusion, I think, among the public. They hear national monument, and I think the vast majority automatically think they are part of the national park system, and that's clearly not the case. In fact, if I had one criticism about the use of the Antiquities Act, I would say that the criticism that Western conservative lawmakers have raised about the Antiquities Act is starting to take root among some liberal and Democrat presidential administrations. Now, as I stated earlier, I think some of the criticism or some of the attacks that conservative lawmakers have made on the Antiquities Act have unfortunately taken root among those that should be the defenders of it. In particular, the current Obama administration, I think, is particularly sensitive to those critiques. Now, rightly, the president has used the Antiquities Act roughly 23 times to designate national monuments, and the administration parrots its use of that act to show how strong it is in protecting the environment and our cultural and natural resources. Unfortunately, in my opinion, what's happened, though, is the president has used it to designate national monuments and placed natural national monuments under agencies such as the BLM or the Fish or the Forest Service, agencies that historically have not had the best track record in protecting the environment. Their mission is multiple use. They are, by law, required to allow more extractive uses of those areas, such as logging, ranching, and mining, but also things like intensive recreation like ATVs and snowmobiles. And roughly 13 or 14 of the monument designations the president have made have been natural national monuments, have all been placed under the BLM or the the Forest Service. While the 9 national monuments that are placed under the Park Service, the majority of those, 7 or so, are cultural or historic sites, roughly buildings and historic places that are relatively small and have little ecological benefit. Only 2 sites, Tule Springs and Castle National Monument, are what you would consider the traditional natural sites and have been designated and put under the National Park Service. And I believe this is in part because the president has become sensitive to the critiques by the conservative lawmakers. And sadly, in my opinion, I also think conservation groups have become sensitive to these arguments as well and don't push back and push for the establishment of large natural national monuments, especially in the West. The president has that authority, and hopefully in his remaining months as president, he will use it to establish several new national park monuments on his way out. And I've got some ideas on what those should be. So this is the part of the show where I get to pretend that I'm president of the United States and designate those areas that I think should be national monuments. Here's my short list. First, there's been significant effort to establish a Maine Woods National Park. And up in north central Maine, a philanthropist called Roxanne Quimbley, or named Roxanne Quimbley, has been working with locals on gaining support for establishing a national park in north central Maine. She has experienced, she's purchased significant tracts of land up in Maine, tens of thousands of acres, that she would like to give to the federal government and have turned into a national park. She already owns the land, but she's experienced significant public pressure from locals who would like to continue to run snowmobiles or log the area, forgetting the fact that she currently owns it and could prohibit access to it if she wanted to. But Roxanne wants to make a donation to the United States, to the American public, which other philanthropists like John D. Rockefeller have made in the past, and have that turned into a place that all Americans could use. Unfortunately, that opposition has kind of stalled the effort to establish a national park in north central Maine. Here's what I would do. If I was Roxanne Quimbley, I would donate the land to the federal government and ask the president to designate it as a national monument to be managed under the National Park Service. In fact, this makes good political sense, and I would leak this idea to the public saying, look, this is going to happen, or this could happen. If you'd like to be part of the process, you need to negotiate with me and work on how we can make this park idea work for all. But if you're going to continue to fight and try and stop the establishment of a national park, she can easily donate the land to the federal government with the understanding that the president will designate it as a national monument. And then it would just be Roxanne Quimby and the president who would determine how and what uses would take place on that land. So if I was president, that would be my first monument. Second one, as I mentioned earlier, a number of national monuments have been established and placed under agency management other than the National Park Service. And if I were president, I would use my authority as the commander-in-chief under the Antiquities Act to transfer management of some of those national monuments to the Park Service, because I believe the Park Service has a much stronger conservation mission, much stronger conservation history, and does a better job at preserving and protecting places, but also in welcoming tens, if not hundreds of millions of visitors every year. So this message or this argument that the Park Service shuts people out is simply not the case. Year after year, the Park Service is breaking visitation records, and we're seeing more and more people going to their parks. So if you want a place to be enjoyed and visited, more often than not, it should be under the National Park Service's management. So my first and top place that should be transferred is Mount St. Helens. This comes as a surprise to many people, but Mount St. Helens is a national monument, but it's not run by the National Park Service. It's run by the U.S. Forest Service, who does an admirable job managing the national monument, but it's kind of on its own. It's a orphan child that is lacking or doesn't benefit from the marketing and the high profile that the National Park System has. Just to the north of it is Mount Rainier, and it sees 2 and 2.5 million visitors a year, whereas Mount St. Helens is only seeing about 1 million visitors a year. If just changing the designation from Forest Service monument to a National Park Service monument, and then if we could get Congress to elevate it to a national park, there's research out there that shows just the name change alone results in tens of thousands of additional visitors. And that, for local economies, which seem to always be the place where we get the most opposition to adding places to the National Park Service, would be a significant benefit. So if I was president, my second act would be to transfer Mount St. Helens from the U.S. Forest Service to the National Park Service. Finally, I would go a little bit out of the box and a little bit actually off planet for my last designation of national monuments. And I have mentioned this in my TED Talk, but I believe the Apollo lander sites should be designated as national monuments as well. The Apollo landers are federal property, so they meet that criteria of needing to be owned by the federal government in order to be established as a national monument. We are seeing more and more countries expanding their space exploration programs, and it's only a matter of time until we return to the moon. And I'm concerned that at some future point, private companies or even other countries will visit those sites, the Apollo lander sites, and could salvage them if they're not designated or protected under federal law. What I like about this idea is that it wouldn't require any additional funds to manage them, but would garner significant public interest and understanding and raise the awareness of the public of the Antiquities Act and the National Monument System. It would also be the first establishment of a national monument off planet, because eventually it's my hope and expectation that humans will eventually migrate off Earth, and we're going to need to take our conservation ethos and ethic with us. And why not use it to establish a monument on the moon to recognize the place where humans first set foot on another planet or another heavenly body. So my 3 monuments which I would establish a Maine Woods National Park, a national monument. I would transfer Mount St. Helens from the Forest Service to the Park Service as a national monument, and I would designate the 6 lunar lander sites as national monuments. Thank you for listening. National Park Talk is produced and recorded in Western Washington, in the shadow of Mount Rainier. To learn more about National Park Talk, please visit our website at seandavidSmith.blogspot.com or follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/parkthrillers. To find us on Twitter, search for @parkthrillers. I'm Sean Smith. Thanks again for listening to National Park Talk.